Some scars never fade, but some stories need to be told. My name is Margaret Eleanor Whitfield, and at 79 years old, I'm finally ready to share the darkest chapter of my life. Most people who see me now, a great-grandmother of 8, tending to my garden in this quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, have no idea of the hell I survived for 15 years. The roses blooming outside my kitchen window have witnessed more tears than anyone should shed in a lifetime, but they've also seen me rebuild myself from nothing. What I'm about to tell you happened in the 1960s and 70s, in a time when women, like me, had nowhere to turn, no one to believe us, and no laws to protect us. This is the story of how I lost everything I held dear, and how I found the strength to claw my way back to life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was born Margaret Eleanor Sullivan in 1945 in the small mill town of Millfield, Oregon, nestled in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains. My father, Patrick Sullivan, worked the lumber mills that kept our town alive, his hands permanently stained with sawdust and pine sap. My mother, Catherine, took in sewing to help make ends meet, her fingers dancing across fabric late into the night by the light of our single table lamp. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on Elm Street, with white picket fencing that my father had built himself and a vegetable garden that my mother tended with religious devotion. The house always smelled of fresh bread and my mother's lavender soap, scents that even now can transport me back to those innocent days when I believed the world was fundamentally good. Growing up in Millfield in the 1950s meant knowing everyone in town, attending the same Methodist church every Sunday, and understanding that hard work and decent values were all a person really needed to get by. My parents were loving but strict, raising me with firm expectations about how a young lady should behave. I learned to cook, clean, sew, and care for others before I learned to drive. Education was important, but only to a point. After all, a woman's primary role was to become a wife and mother. I was a good student at Millfield High School, earning solid grades in all my subjects, but I particularly loved literature and history. Mrs. Henderson, my English teacher, often told me I had a gift for writing and encouraged me to consider college. But college seemed as distant and unrealistic as traveling to the moon. Girls from families like mine didn't go to college. We graduated, maybe worked for a year or two, and then married local boys and started families of our own. That's exactly what I thought would happen when I met Robert James Whitfield in the spring of 1962. I was 17, a senior in high school, and he was 21, having just completed his service in the Army. Robert had grown up in Millfield too, though he was 4 years older than me, so our paths had never really crossed until he returned from his military service. He was undeniably handsome, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that he kept meticulously combed and green eyes that seemed to sparkle when he smiled. More importantly, he seemed mature and worldly compared to the boys my age. He'd seen places beyond Oregon, had served his country, and carried himself with a confidence that I found magnetic. Robert worked at his father's auto repair shop, Whitfield Automotive, which had been serving Millfield for over 20 years. The Whitfields were considered a respectable family in town, not wealthy but stable and hardworking. Robert's father, James Whitfield, was known as an honest mechanic who never overcharged customers, and his mother, Helen, taught Sunday school at our church. When Robert first asked me to the spring dance at the community center, I felt like the luckiest girl in Millfield. He was polite and charming when he came to pick me up, shaking my father's hand firmly and complimenting my mother on her flower garden. He brought me a corsage of white carnations and opened every door for me throughout the evening. That first date was magical in the way that only teenage romance can be. We danced to songs by Elvis Presley and Bobby Vinton, shared a strawberry milkshake at Murphy's Diner afterward, and talked for hours about our dreams and hopes for the future. Robert spoke about expanding his father's business. maybe opening a second location in the neighboring town of Cedar Falls. He seemed ambitious and driven, qualities my parents had always told me to look for in a potential husband. Throughout my senior year, Robert and I were practically inseparable. He would pick me up after school in his pristine 1959 Chevrolet Impala, powder blue with white wall tires that he polished every weekend. We'd drive to our favorite spot by Miller's Lake, where we'd sit on the hood of his car and watch the sunset. Paint the water gold and pink. He was my first kiss, my first love, my first everything. Robert had a way of making me feel special, chosen. He would bring me small gifts, a wildflower he'd picked on his way to see me, a book of poetry he thought I'd enjoy, a silver bracelet for my birthday. He listened when I talked about my dreams of maybe becoming a teacher someday, nodding seriously, as if my aspirations were the most important things in the world. My parents adored him. My father appreciated Robert's work ethic and his respectful manner, while my mother was charmed by his old-fashioned courtesy and the way he always complimented her cooking when he joined us for Sunday dinners. "That boy has good character," my father would say after Robert left. "He'll make you a fine husband someday, Maggie." The proposal came 6 months after my high school graduation, on a crisp October evening in 1962. Robert had taken me to the same spot by Miller's Lake where we'd shared so many conversations about our future. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the water, he got down on one knee and pulled out a small velvet box. "Margaret Eleanor Sullivan," he said, his voice trembling slightly with nervousness. "You're the most beautiful, intelligent, and kind woman I've ever known. I can't imagine spending my life with anyone else. Will you marry me?" The ring was modest, a small diamond solitaire that he'd saved for months to afford, but to me, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Through tears of joy, I said yes, and he slipped the ring onto my finger with hands that shook slightly from emotion. We were married on June 15, 1963, in a simple ceremony at Millfield Methodist Church. I wore my mother's wedding dress, altered to fit my smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of white roses and baby's breath from our garden. Robert looked impossibly handsome in his black suit, and when he lifted my veil to kiss me at the altar, I felt like I was living in a fairy tale. The reception was held in the church basement, with tables decorated by the ladies' auxiliary and a 3-tiered cake that Mrs. Patterson, the best baker in town, had made as her wedding gift to us. We danced our first dance to "Love Me Tender," and I remember thinking that this was the beginning of everything beautiful in my life. We moved into a small rental house on Maple Street, just 3 blocks from my childhood home. It was a cozy, 2-bedroom cottage with yellow kitchen cabinets and a backyard perfect for the children we planned to have. I spent the first weeks of our marriage making curtains, arranging furniture, and creating a home for us to begin our life together. For the first few months, marriage was everything I had dreamed it would be. Robert was attentive and affectionate, bringing me flowers on Fridays and surprising me with little romantic gestures. We would spend evenings planning our future, how many children we wanted, at least 3, what we would name them, how we would raise them to be good, decent people like our parents had raised us. I took a job at Miller's Five and Dime, working behind the counter and helping customers find everything from sewing supplies to penny candy. It wasn't glamorous work, but I enjoyed the interaction with townspeople and the small sense of independence that came with earning my own money. Robert seemed proud of my job, often stopping by during his lunch break to chat and sometimes bringing me a sandwich from Murphy's Diner. The first sign that something was wrong came about 6 months after our wedding. I was working late at the store, helping Mr. Miller with inventory, when Robert arrived to pick me up. I was laughing at something Mr. Miller had said about his cat getting into the yarn display when Robert appeared in the doorway. "Ready to go, sweetheart?" he asked, but his smile seemed forced and his eyes were cold. On the drive home, he was unusually quiet. When I asked if everything was okay, he exploded without warning. You seemed pretty friendly with old Miller back there," he said, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel, laughing and carrying on like a schoolgirl. "People are going to start talking, Margaret. They're going to wonder what kind of wife I have." I was stunned. Mr. Miller was nearly 70 years old and had known me since I was a child. The idea that our innocent conversation could be interpreted as anything inappropriate was absurd. "Robert, we were just talking about his cat," I said gently. "There was nothing. Don't tell me what I saw," he snapped, pulling into our driveway with more force than necessary. "I know how men look at you, Margaret. You're too trusting, too naive. You don't understand how your behavior reflects on me, on our marriage." That night, he was cold and distant, turning away from me in bed and refusing to discuss what had upset him. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened, bringing me coffee in bed and kissing me goodbye before work. I convinced myself it had been a momentary jealousy, the kind that all newlyweds probably experienced as they learned to navigate marriage. But the incidents began to multiply. Robert would find fault with the way I spoke to the mailman, the length of time I spent chatting with neighbors, the friendliness I showed to male customers at the store. Each criticism was delivered with the same basic message. I was too naive to understand how my behavior looked to others, and it was his job as my husband to guide and protect me. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, my world began to shrink. Robert suggested it might be better if I didn't work so late at the store. He questioned why I needed to attend the monthly ladies' auxiliary meetings at church. He expressed concern about me walking alone to my parents' house, offering to drive me there and back whenever I wanted to visit. At first, these seemed like the caring gestures of a protective husband. Many of the older women in town spoke approvingly of Robert's attentiveness, noting how he always knew where I was and made sure I was safe. "You're lucky to have a husband who cares so much," Mrs. Henderson told me one Sunday after church. 2. Many men these days don't take proper care of their wives. But by our first wedding anniversary in June 1964, I was beginning to feel isolated and confused. My visits with my parents had become increasingly rare and brief. My friendship with Sally Morrison, my best friend since childhood, had withered under Robert's subtle but persistent criticism of her wild behavior. She had moved to Portland and worked as a secretary, remaining unmarried at 22. The physical violence began gradually, so gradually that I didn't recognize it for what it was at first. A firm grip on my arm when he was making a point. A hand pressed a little too hard against the small of my back when he was guiding me somewhere. Fingers that dug into my shoulder when he was emphasizing how important something was. The first real blow came in August 1964, just 2 months after our first anniversary. I had been late getting home from the store because Mrs. Jenkins had needed help finding a specific pattern for her granddaughter's dress. When I walked through our front door, Robert was waiting in the living room, his face dark with anger. "Where have you been?" he demanded. I explained about Mrs. Jenkins, but before I could finish my sentence, his hand cracked across my cheek with a sound that seemed to echo through the small house. The force of it knocked me sideways, and I caught myself against the wall, my hand instinctively rising to my burning cheek. We stared at each other in shock. I had never been struck by anyone in my life. My parents believed in discipline through words and consequences, never physical punishment. The sensation was not just painful, but utterly foreign, as if the natural order of the world had suddenly shifted. "Margaret?" Robert said, his voice immediately softening, his face crumpling with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Oh, God. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. I was just worried sick about you, and when you didn't come home." He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as he apologized over and over, his voice breaking with emotion. He explained that he'd been having a terrible day at the shop, a difficult customer, a botched repair job, his father criticizing his work. He'd come home looking forward to the comfort and peace I provided, and when I wasn't there, His worry had transformed into irrational anger. "I love you so much, Margaret," he whispered into my hair. "The thought of something happening to you, of losing you, it makes me crazy. I promise this will never happen again. I promise." And I believed him. I wanted to believe him. This was my husband, the man I had pledged my life to, the father of the children I hoped to have. Everyone had bad days. Everyone made mistakes. What mattered was that he recognized his error and was genuinely sorry for it. That night, Robert was more tender and attentive than he had been in months. He drew me a bath, made my favorite dinner, and spent the evening holding me while we listened to music on the radio. He spoke about his childhood, about the pressure he felt to live up to his father's expectations, about his deep fear of not being good enough as a husband and provider. I found myself comforting him, reassuring him that he was a good man who had simply made a mistake. By bedtime, the incident felt like an aberration, a single dark moment in an otherwise loving marriage. I convinced myself that understanding and forgiveness would prevent it from happening again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second incident happened 3 weeks later, and this time there was no dramatic trigger, no excuse Robert could point to as justification. I had simply burned the pot roast while helping my neighbor Mrs. Carson with her groceries. When Robert came home to the smell of charred meat and saw the ruined dinner, he didn't say a word. He just walked over to where I stood apologizing at the stove and backhanded me across the mouth so hard that I tasted blood. This time, there was no immediate remorse, no tearful apology. He simply sat down at the kitchen table, loosened his tie and said, "Fix me something else, and next time, pay attention to what you're doing instead of gossiping with the neighbors." I stood there, my lips split and swelling, staring at this man I had promised to love, honor, and obey. The Robert who had courted me so gently, who had written me love letters during our engagement, seemed to have vanished completely. In his place was someone cold and calculating, someone who could hurt me and then calmly demand dinner as if nothing had happened. But it was 1964, and I was 19 years old with nowhere to go and no framework for understanding what was happening. To me, divorce was scandalous and rare, especially in a small town like Millfield. Women who left their husbands were viewed with suspicion and pity, often forced to move away in shame. The few divorced women I knew of had lost their standing in the community. Their children whispered about at school, their reputations permanently tarnished. More importantly, I had been raised to believe that marriage was sacred, that whatever problems arose between husband and wife should be worked out through prayer, patience, and submission. My mother had often told me that a good wife could bring out the best in any man through love and understanding. When times got tough, you didn't run away. You tried harder, loved deeper, and trusted God to heal whatever was broken. So I fixed Robert a sandwich that night, holding a dish towel to my bleeding lip while I worked. I told myself that the stress of starting married life, of trying to establish himself in his father's business, of providing for a household, was making him act in ways that weren't really him. I convinced myself that with enough patience and love, I could help him become the man I knew he truly was underneath all that anger. The pattern that emerged over the following months was insidious in its unpredictability. Robert could go weeks being the charming, attentive husband I had fallen in love with, bringing me flowers, taking me dancing at the community center, making love to me with a tenderness that left me believing we had turned a corner. Then, without warning, something would set him off. A meal that wasn't ready on time, a comment I made that he interpreted as criticism, my failure to anticipate one of his needs or moods. The violence escalated gradually. What started as slaps across the face progressed to punches to my ribs and stomach, areas where bruises could be hidden beneath my clothing. Robert seemed to have an instinctive understanding of how to hurt me without leaving visible evidence. He learned exactly how hard he could hit me without breaking bones, how to grip my arms and shoulders in ways that would leave fingerprint bruises, but nothing that would show when I wore sleeves. I became an expert at concealing the evidence of my marriage's dark reality. I learned which makeup could cover which kinds of marks, how to style my hair to hide a bruised temple, how to move carefully so that no one would notice when my ribs were tender from his kicks. I perfected a smile that could mask any amount of pain, a cheerful voice that betrayed nothing of the terror that had become my constant companion. The isolation that Robert had begun engineering during our engagement became complete after we married. He had successfully alienated me from most of my friends through criticism and subtle manipulation. Sally Morrison, my closest friend since childhood, eventually stopped calling after Robert repeatedly made her feel unwelcome in our home, questioning her lifestyle choices and moral character whenever she visited. My relationship with my parents became strained as Robert inserted himself between us with surgical precision. He would offer to drive me to their house but then find reasons why we needed to leave early. He began declining their invitations to Sunday dinner, claiming he was too tired from work or that my mother's cooking didn't agree with him. When my parents called, he would answer the phone and have long conversations with them himself, effectively controlling the information that flowed between us. "Your parents called earlier," he would tell me casually. "I let them know you were busy with housework. Your father mentioned that tree branch that fell in their yard after the storm last week, so I told him I'd come by this weekend to help. Clean it up? No need for you to worry about it." On the surface, this seemed like the behavior of a caring son-in-law, but it served to make my parents feel that Robert was handling my care and communication, reducing their sense that they needed to check on me regularly. Gradually, the phone calls became less frequent, the invitations stopped coming, and I found myself completely dependent on Robert for all social interaction. The women at church noticed my increasing absence from ladies' auxiliary meetings and social gatherings, but Robert had a ready explanation for everything. I was feeling under the weather, I was busy with household projects, I was struggling with shyness as a new bride. These explanations were readily accepted because they fit the expectations of what a young wife's life should look like. Quiet, domestic, centered entirely around her husband's needs and comfort. Mrs. Patterson, the church organist, pulled me aside one Sunday after service in late 1964. "Margaret, dear, we've missed you at our meetings. Are you settling into married life all right?" I had been married for over a year by then, but I forced a bright smile and nodded enthusiastically. "Oh yes, Mrs. Patterson. Marriage is wonderful. Robert keeps me so busy taking care of our home that I barely have time for anything else." She smiled approvingly. "That's how it should be, dear. A woman's first responsibility is to her husband and home. But don't forget that fellowship with other Christian women is important too. We'd love to have you back when you can manage it." I promised I would try to attend the next meeting, knowing even as I spoke that Robert would find a reason why I couldn't go. And indeed, when I mentioned Mrs. Patterson's invitation that afternoon, his jaw tightened in that way I had learned to fear. "I don't like the idea of you gossiping with those old biddies," he said, not looking up from the newspaper he was reading. "Women get together and all they do is complain about their husbands and fill each other's heads with nonsense. You have better things to do with your time." The conversation was over. I never brought up the ladies' auxiliary again. By the spring of 1965, I had learned to live in a constant state of hypervigilance, reading Robert's moods like my life depended on it. Because in many ways, it did. I could tell from the sound of his car door slamming whether he'd had a good day or a bad one. I could interpret the set of his shoulders as he walked up our front steps, the way he hung his keys on the hook by the door, the tone of his voice when he called out his greeting. On good days, I would feel a rush of relief so intense it made me dizzy. We would have dinner together like a normal married couple, maybe listen to music on the radio or play cards at the kitchen table. Robert would tell me about his day at the shop, ask about mine, even help me with the dishes. These moments of normalcy became precious to me, proof that the man I had fallen in love with still existed somewhere inside the stranger I lived with. But the bad days became more frequent and more severe. Robert's anger seemed to be growing, feeding on itself, becoming hungrier and more demanding with each expression. What had once been isolated incidents began happening weekly, then several times a week. I learned to dread the sound of his footsteps on our porch, the jingle of his keys in the lock. The worst part wasn't even the physical pain, though that was becoming harder to bear as Robert's violence escalated. The worst part was the constant fear, the way it poisoned every moment of every day. I would lie awake at night listening to him breathe, wondering what might set him off tomorrow. I would stand in our kitchen preparing his breakfast, my hands shaking as I tried to make everything perfect, knowing that any small mistake might trigger his rage. I began to see myself through his eyes, to internalize his criticisms and complaints. Maybe I was too chatty with the neighbors. Maybe I did spend too much time on my appearance when he thought I should be focusing on housework. Maybe I was ungrateful for the home he provided, the security he offered, the protection of his name and status in the community. The gaslighting was so subtle and persistent that I barely recognized it happening. Robert had a way of rewriting history, of making me question my own memories and perceptions. After he hit me, he would often claim that I had provoked him, that I had said or done something that any reasonable person would find infuriating. He would remind me of my faults and shortcomings until I found myself apologizing for his violence, promising to try harder to be the wife he deserved. "I don't know why you make me so angry, Margaret," he would say after particularly brutal attacks, shaking his head sadly as if my behavior was a puzzle he couldn't solve. "I love you more than anything in this world, but sometimes you just push and push until I snap. I don't want to hurt you, but you have to learn to think before you speak, to consider how your actions affect me." In the twisted logic of our marriage, I became responsible not only for my own behavior, but for his reactions to it. If he hit me, it was because I had failed to anticipate his needs or had somehow triggered his temper. If he screamed at me, it was because I hadn't been listening carefully enough to what he was trying to tell me. Every act of violence became my fault. Every moment of his anger became evidence of my inadequacy as a wife. By late 1965, I had essentially disappeared as an individual. The confident, optimistic girl who had graduated from high school with dreams of maybe becoming a teacher had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt in Robert's image of what a wife should be: silent, submissive, grateful, and terrified. I spoke only when spoken to, moved through our house like a ghost, and had learned to make myself so small and unobtrusive that sometimes entire days would pass with barely a word exchanged between us. The physical transformation was dramatic, too. I had lost weight that I couldn't afford to lose, my clothes hanging loose on my increasingly frail frame. My hair, once thick and shiny, had become dull and lifeless. But most noticeably, the light had gone out of my eyes. In photographs from our early marriage, I could see the gradual change, the bright smile becoming forced, the spark of joy dimming until nothing remained but a hollow mask of compliance. It was during this darkest period that I discovered I was pregnant with our first child. The news should have been a source of pure joy. We had talked about children from the very beginning of our relationship, planned the nursery we would create, chosen names for the sons and daughters we hoped to have. Instead, as I sat in Dr. Morrison's office in December 1965, listening to him confirm what I had suspected for several weeks, all I could feel was a deep, cold terror. How could I bring a child into this house of violence? How could I protect a baby when I couldn't even protect myself? And most frightening of all, what would happen to Robert's carefully controlled rage when our quiet, orderly house was disrupted by the chaos that comes with an infant? But underneath the fear was something else. Something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Maybe a baby would change things. Maybe becoming a father would remind Robert of the gentle, loving man he had once been. Maybe the responsibility of caring for a child would give him the motivation he needed to control his temper, to become the husband and father I knew he could be. When I told Robert about the pregnancy that evening, his reaction was everything I had hoped for and more. His face lit up with genuine joy, the first real emotion I had seen from him in weeks that wasn't anger or frustration. He swept me up in his arms, spinning me around our small kitchen while tears of happiness streamed down his face. "We're going to have a baby," he kept repeating, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "Margaret, we're going to be parents." For the next several weeks, it seemed like my prayers had been answered. Robert was tender and attentive in ways he hadn't been since our honeymoon. He brought me breakfast in bed, helped with household chores, and spent hours reading pregnancy books he had borrowed from the library. He began talking about converting our spare room into a nursery, planning improvements to the house that would make it safer for children. Most importantly, the violence stopped completely. Robert seemed genuinely horrified by the idea that his anger might affect our unborn child. When situations arose that would normally trigger his rage, he would take deep breaths, walk away, or simply leave the house until he had calmed down. For the first time in over a year, I began to relax, to hope that we might actually have the happy marriage I had once dreamed of. But even as I celebrated this transformation, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered warnings I wasn't ready to hear. The anger hadn't disappeared. It had simply been redirected, suppressed, pushed down beneath the surface where it continued to simmer and grow. And pressures that are contained without being released don't vanish. They build until they find a way to explode with devastating force. The explosion, when it came, would shatter not only my remaining illusions about my marriage, but also the most precious thing I had ever carried, the tiny life growing inside me, the child who represented all my hopes for a different future. The months of my pregnancy were like living in a beautiful dream after years of nightmares. For the first time since our marriage began, I experienced the man I had fallen in love with, tender, protective, genuinely excited about our future together. Robert would place his hands on my growing belly each night, talking softly to our unborn child, making promises about the father he would be. "This little one is going to have everything I never had," he would whisper, his voice thick with emotion. "A stable home, parents who love each other, security. I'm going to teach him to fish and hunt, to work with his hands, to be a good man." Dr. Morrison confirmed we were having a boy in my 5th month, and Robert's joy was infectious. We spent weekends shopping for baby furniture in the larger town of Cedar Falls, 30 miles away. Robert insisted on buying the best crib we could afford, running his hands over the smooth wood rails as if he could already see our son sleeping peacefully inside. We painted the spare room a soft blue, with white trim that Robert painstakingly applied with the precision he brought to his work at the automotive shop. I sewed curtains from cheerful yellow fabric decorated with tiny ducks, and we hung a mobile of wooden airplanes that Robert had carved himself in the evenings after work. The room became a sanctuary, a symbol of all our hopes for redemption and new beginnings. During this period, Robert encouraged me to reconnect with my parents, driving me to their house for Sunday dinners and staying to help my father with projects around their property. He seemed genuinely proud to show off my expanding waistline, his arm possessively but gently around my shoulders as he accepted congratulations from neighbors and church members. 7 months along and still glowing, Mrs. Henderson commented, after church one Sunday in April 1966. "Pregnancy suits you, Margaret. You look happier than I've seen you in years." She was right. For the first time since our wedding, I felt like myself again. The constant hypervigilance that had become my normal state began to fade, replaced by the natural preoccupation of expectant motherhood. I read everything I could find about babies and child-rearing, knitted tiny sweaters and booties, and allowed myself to daydream about our son's future. Robert even encouraged me to attend a few ladies' auxiliary meetings, proud to have me show off my pregnancy to the other women. I found myself reconnecting with friendships that had withered during the worst periods of our marriage, grateful for the normalcy of discussing baby names and nursery preparations instead of hiding bruises and making excuses. "You seem like a completely different person," Sally Morrison told me when she visited one afternoon in late spring. She had driven down from Portland specifically to see me, having heard about my pregnancy through mutual friends. "Marriage and motherhood obviously agree with you." I didn't tell her about the dark years that had preceded this peaceful period. How could I explain that the happiness she observed was so precious precisely because I knew how quickly it could disappear? Instead, I simply smiled and offered her tea, cherishing the simple pleasure of having a friend in my home again. The baby was due in late July, and as summer approached, Robert became increasingly attentive to my comfort and needs. He installed a ceiling fan in our bedroom to help with the heat, brought me ice cream from Murphy's Diner when I mentioned craving it, and insisted that I rest in the afternoons instead of doing housework. "Your only job right now is taking care of yourself and our son," he would say, actually doing dishes himself or sweeping the kitchen floor. "Everything else can wait." This version of Robert was everything I had hoped marriage would be. A true partnership where we cared for each other and worked together toward common goals. I began to believe that the violence of our early marriage had been an aberration, a result of adjustment stress and immaturity that we had successfully overcome. After all, it had been over 6 months since he had raised a hand to me, and his transformation seemed genuine and complete. My mother, during one of our Sunday visits, pulled me aside while Robert was helping my father repair a fence post. "I can see how happy you are, sweetheart," she said, smoothing a hand over my belly. "Robert has become such a devoted husband. Whatever difficulties you two worked through in your first year, you've clearly found your way to something beautiful." Had never told my parents about Robert's violence, of course. The shame of it, combined with my mother's firm belief that marriage problems should be resolved privately through prayer and patience, had kept me silent even during the worst times. Now, seeing their approval of our apparent happiness, I felt vindicated in my decision to stay and work things out. As my due date approached, Robert became almost obsessively protective. He drove me to every doctor's appointment, taking time off work that he couldn't really afford to lose. He installed new locks on our doors and checked them multiple times each night, as if his vigilance alone could protect me and the baby from any possible harm. "I've never been responsible for anything this important before," he confided to me one evening as we sat on our small front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "I want to do everything right, Margaret. I want to be the kind of father who deserves a son like ours is going to be." His hand rested on my belly as he spoke, and I could feel our baby responding to his touch with gentle kicks and movements. In that moment, watching Robert's face soften with wonder every time he felt our child move, I was absolutely certain that we had found our way to lasting happiness. The labor pains began on a sweltering Tuesday morning in late July, 3 days before my due date. Robert had left for work early, planning to finish a particularly challenging repair job so he could take time off once the baby arrived. I was alone in the house when the first contraction hit, a wave of pain that took my breath away and sent me gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. At first, I tried to convince myself it was false labor. Dr. Morrison had warned me that first-time mothers often experienced practice contractions in the weeks before delivery. But as the morning progressed, the pains became more regular and intense, leaving no doubt that our son was ready to enter the world. I called Robert at the shop, and he rushed home immediately, his face pale with excitement and terror. "Is it time?" he kept asking as he helped me to the car. "Are you sure it's really happening?" The drive to the small hospital in Cedar Falls seemed to take forever, though it was probably no more than 30 minutes. Robert gripped my hand between contractions, murmuring words of encouragement and love. "You're so brave, Margaret. You're going to be such a wonderful mother. our boy is lucky to have you." The hospital staff knew us from our preparatory visits, and Dr. Morrison met us at the entrance with a wheelchair and a calm smile. "Let's go have this baby," he said cheerfully, and I felt a surge of confidence. Everything was going to be perfect. The labor progressed normally for several hours. Robert stayed by my side, holding my hand through contractions and wiping my forehead with cool cloths. He seemed amazed by my strength, telling me over and over how proud he was of me, how grateful he was that I was giving him this gift of fatherhood. But as evening approached, something changed. Dr. Morrison's expression became more serious during his examinations, and I noticed the nurses exchanging glances that seemed loaded with concern. The baby's heartbeat, which had been strong and steady throughout the day, began showing signs of distress. "What's wrong?" Robert demanded when Dr. Morrison stepped out to consult with another physician. "What aren't you telling us?" Dr. Morrison returned with Dr. Hayes, the only other physician at the small hospital who had experience with complicated deliveries. Their faces were grave as they explained that the umbilical cord had become wrapped around the baby's neck, compromising his oxygen supply. "We need to deliver this baby immediately," Dr. Morrison said. "We're going to try forceps first, but if that doesn't work quickly, we may need to consider other options." The next hour became a blur of urgent medical activity. The pain of natural labor was nothing compared to the terror I felt as I watched the medical staff work frantically to save my son's life. Robert stood pressed against the wall, his face white with shock, as nurses prepared equipment and Dr. Morrison attempted the forceps delivery. I could see it in their eyes before anyone spoke the words. The baby wasn't breathing. Our son, the child we had planned for and dreamed about and loved before we even met him, was born silent and still. Dr. Morrison worked desperately to resuscitate him, but after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he finally stopped and looked up at us with infinite sadness. "I'm so very sorry," he said quietly. "We did everything we could." The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of all the sounds that should have filled that room. No first cry, no excited congratulations, no joyful phone calls to grandparents. Just a terrible, echoing emptiness that seemed to swallow everything. Robert's reaction was immediate and devastating. The grief hit him like a physical blow, doubling him over as if someone had punched him in the stomach. But underneath the grief, I could see something else building, the familiar darkness that I had hoped pregnancy had permanently banished. "How did this happen?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You said everything was fine. You said first babies sometimes take longer, but that everything was normal." Dr. Morrison tried to explain about cord complications, about how these tragedies sometimes occurred despite everyone's best efforts, about how nothing anyone had done or failed to do had caused our loss. But Robert wasn't listening to medical explanations. He was looking for someone to blame, and his eyes kept returning to me with an expression I recognized but had hoped never to see again. The funeral was held 3 days later at Millfield Methodist Church. Our son, whom we named James Patrick Whitfield after both his grandfathers, was buried in a tiny white casket in the cemetery where generations of our families lay. The entire town seemed to turn out for the service, bringing casseroles and flowers and awkward words of sympathy. But their kindness couldn't penetrate the fog of grief that had descended over both Robert and me. We moved through the rituals of mourning like sleepwalkers, accepting condolences and burial sympathy visits with the hollow politeness of people who had forgotten how to feel anything beyond loss. The real horror began after the funeral guests left and we returned to our empty house, to the nursery we had prepared with such love and hope. Robert stood in the doorway of that blue room, staring at the crib that would never hold our son, and I watched the last traces of the gentle man I had known during my pregnancy disappear forever. "This is your fault," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion but heavy with accusation. You did something wrong. You must have lifted something too heavy or moved wrong or something. Healthy babies don't just die. I tried to protest, to repeat what Dr. Morrison had explained about the cord accident, but Robert cut me off with a look of such cold fury that the words died in my throat. In his grief-stricken mind, someone had to be responsible for our tragedy. And since I was the one who had carried our child, I was the one who had failed to protect him. The violence that had been dormant during my pregnancy returned with a vengeance that made our early marriage look gentle by comparison. Robert's rage, suppressed and redirected for 9 months, exploded with the force of a dam bursting. But now it carried not just his usual anger and frustration, but also the devastating weight of grief and the desperate need to blame someone for the most painful loss of his life. The first beating came the night after the funeral, when I was Guy. Still physically recovering from the difficult labor and emotionally shattered by our loss, Robert found me crying in the nursery, holding one of the tiny sweaters I had knitted, and something in him snapped completely. "Stop your crying," he said, his voice cold and flat. "Crying won't bring him back. If you had taken better care of yourself, if you had been more careful, he'd still be alive." When I continued sobbing, unable to stop the flood of grief, he dragged me from the nursery and threw me against the hallway wall with such force that I saw stars. "I said stop," he growled, and for the first time since our marriage began, I saw not just anger in his eyes, but something far more dangerous, a complete absence of love or recognition, as if I had become not his wife, but simply an object on which to vent his pain. This was no longer the controlled violence of our early marriage, calculated to hurt without leaving obvious evidence. This was raw, primitive fury that seemed to have no limits or boundaries. And unlike before, when Robert's violence had been followed by remorse and promises to change, there was no apology this time, no acknowledgement that he had done anything wrong. In his mind, I had killed our son through negligence or carelessness, and any punishment he inflicted was justice rather than abuse. The man who had once promised to protect and cherish me had become my executioner, and I began to understand that this time, there might be no coming back from the darkness that had consumed him. The months following our son's death transformed our house into a place I no longer recognized. The walls that had once echoed with laughter and hopeful conversations about the future now seemed to absorb sound, creating a suffocating silence broken only by Robert's increasingly frequent explosions of rage. The nursery door remained closed, but its presence haunted every corner of our home like a shrine to shattered dreams. Robert's grief manifested as a consuming need to punish someone for our loss, and I became the sole target of that punishment. Every morning when he left for work, I would find myself holding my breath until evening, dreading the sound of his car in our driveway. I never knew which version of him would walk through our front door: the silent, cold stranger who ignored my existence entirely, or the violent man who blamed me for every moment of pain he endured. The worst part was that there was no pattern I could decipher, no way to predict what might trigger his next attack. In our early marriage, I had learned to read his moods and adjust my behavior accordingly, but grief had made him unpredictable in ways that terrified me. A meal prepared exactly to his specifications might be thrown against the wall because the sight of food reminded him that our son would never eat my cooking. A gentle question about his day could result in a backhand across my face, because how dare I pretend that anything about any day mattered when our child was dead? "You walk around here like nothing happened," he accused me one evening in September, finding me hanging laundry on the line behind our house. The accusation was absurd. I was a shell of my former self, moving through each day like a ghost, barely eating, barely sleeping, barely existing. But in Robert's twisted perception, the fact that I continued breathing while our son couldn't was evidence of my callousness. Without warning, he grabbed me by the throat and slammed me against the side of our house, his fingers digging into my windpipe until I saw black spots dancing at the edges of my vision. "He's dead because of you," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "You killed him, and you don't even care." I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but claw, helplessly at his hands as he squeezed tighter. Just when I thought I might lose consciousness, he released me, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping and choking while he walked back into the house as if nothing had happened. These attacks became more frequent and more severe as autumn progressed. Robert seemed to be testing the limits of how much damage he could inflict without killing me outright, and I began to suspect that even that boundary was becoming negotiable in his mind. The careful restraint he had once shown, hitting me where bruises wouldn't show, being mindful of permanent damage, disappeared entirely. He broke 2 of my ribs in October, kicking me repeatedly in the side after I accidentally dropped a plate while washing dishes. The crash of the breaking china seemed to trigger something primal in him, as if the sound itself was an insult to our dead son's memory. I lay on the kitchen floor, unable to move, while he stood over me screaming about my clumsiness, my worthlessness, my responsibility for every bad thing that had ever happened in his life. I should have gone to the hospital, but Robert made it clear that seeking medical attention would result in consequences far worse than anything I was already enduring. "Tell anyone about this, and I'll finish what I started," he warned, and I believed him completely. Instead, I wrapped my ribs with strips torn from old bedsheets and pretended that the stabbing pain with every breath was manageable. The isolation that had begun during our early marriage became complete during this period. Robert had successfully alienated me from every source of potential support, and my own shame and terror kept me from reaching out to the few people who might have helped. How could I explain to my parents or the church ladies that the devoted husband they had admired during my pregnancy had become a monster? How could I admit that I was living in daily fear of the man I had promised to love, honor, and obey? More importantly, where could I go? It was 1966, and options for women in my situation were virtually non-existent. There were no domestic violence shelters, no legal protections for abused wives, no social services designed to help women escape violent marriages. Divorce required proving fault, and Robert's violence left no witnesses except me. Even if I could somehow document the abuse, leaving him would mean losing everything: my home, my community, my standing in society. Women who left their husbands were treated as moral failures, suspected of adultery or mental instability. They lost custody of their children, were shunned by their churches, and often found themselves unemployable and homeless. I had no education beyond high school, no job skills that could support me independently, and no family wealthy enough to take me in permanently. So I stayed, and with each passing day, I felt more pieces of myself breaking away until I could barely remember who I had been before this nightmare began. The confident, optimistic girl who had married Robert with such hope and joy seemed like a character from a book I had read long ago, so far removed from my current reality that she might have been fictional. The second pregnancy happened in November 1966, just 4 months after we lost James Patrick. I discovered it the same way I had the first time: missed periods, morning nausea, a strange exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. But this time, instead of joy, I felt only a deep, cold terror that seemed to freeze my blood in my veins. How could I protect another child when I couldn't protect myself? What would happen to a baby born into this house of violence and grief? And most frightening of all, would Robert's reaction to this pregnancy be relief and renewed hope? Or would he see it as another opportunity for me to fail him? I delayed, telling him for 2 weeks, hoping desperately that I was wrong, that the symptoms were caused by stress and trauma rather than another life growing inside me. But when Dr. Morrison confirmed my fears during a secretive visit to his office, I knew I couldn't hide the truth any longer. Robert's reaction was unlike anything I could have predicted. When I told him that evening, expecting either violence or demands that I somehow make the pregnancy disappear. He instead broke down completely. He sobbed like a child, great heaving cries that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. "I can't lose another one," he kept saying through his tears. "Margaret, I can't go through that again. I won't survive it." For a brief moment, I thought I saw a glimpse of the man I had once loved, the vulnerable person hiding underneath all that rage and pain. But as his tears dried, they were replaced by something far more dangerous than grief, an obsessive determination to control every aspect of this pregnancy to ensure a different outcome. If Robert had been protective during my first pregnancy, he became absolutely tyrannical during my second. He insisted that I quit my part-time job at the Five and Dime immediately, claiming that any physical exertion might harm the baby. He forbade me from lifting anything heavier than a dinner plate, from walking anywhere alone, from doing housework that required bending or stretching. "You're not going to kill this one too," he told me matter-of-factly, as if my responsibility for our first son's death was an established fact. "This time, you're going to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, and maybe this baby will have a chance." The pregnancy became a prison within a prison. Robert monitored everything I ate, everything I drank, every activity I engaged in throughout the day. He installed locks on the outside of doors to rooms he considered dangerous, the basement, the garage, even the bathroom, giving himself complete control over my movements within our own home. He accompanied me to every doctor's appointment, answering questions that Dr. Morrison directed to me and insisting on detailed explanations of every test and examination. When Dr. Morrison suggested that my obvious weight loss and apparent anxiety might be affecting the pregnancy, Robert immediately blamed my emotional weakness rather than considering that his behavior might be the source of my distress. "She's always been high-strung," he explained to the doctor while I sat silently on the examination table. "She worries too much, thinks too much. I keep telling her that stress isn't good for the baby, but she won't listen." Dr. Morrison's eyes lingered on my face with what I thought might be concern, but he said nothing directly. In 1966, doctors rarely questioned a husband's account of his wife's behavior, and certainly didn't intervene in what were considered private marital matters. I was examined and treated as if I were a vessel for the baby rather than a person, with rights and feelings of my own. The violence didn't stop during this pregnancy, but it became more calculated, more precisely targeted. Robert seemed to have researched exactly how to hurt me without risking harm to the child I carried. He would grab my hair and slam my head against walls, being careful to avoid my abdomen. He would twist my arms behind my back until I thought my shoulders might dislocate, but never in ways that might cause me to fall. The psychological torture was even worse than the physical abuse. Robert seemed to take pleasure in reminding me constantly that this baby's life depended entirely on my ability to follow his instructions perfectly. Any small mistake, burning dinner, forgetting to dust a shelf, speaking when he wanted silence, was treated as evidence that I was already failing this child just as I had failed the first. "You're going to kill this one too, aren't you?" he would whisper in my ear during particularly brutal attacks. "You're too selfish, too careless to keep a baby safe. You don't deserve to be a mother." These words hurt worse than any physical blow because part of me was beginning to believe them. Maybe I was responsible for James Patrick's death. Maybe I was too weak, too stupid, too fundamentally flawed to successfully carry a child to term. The constant repetition of these accusations wore down my resistance until I found myself accepting them as truth. By my 6th month, I was essentially a prisoner in my own home. Robert had convinced my parents that my previous pregnancy loss had made me emotionally fragile, and that too much stimulation might cause another tragedy. They accepted his explanation that I needed complete rest and isolation, praising him for being such a devoted husband during this difficult time. "Robert is taking such good care of you," my mother said during one of her brief supervised visits. "It's wonderful to see a man so committed to protecting his wife and baby." I wanted to scream, to beg her to look closer, to see the fear in my eyes and the bruises I had learned to hide so skillfully. But Robert never left us alone together, and the few times I tried to communicate my distress through meaningful glances or subtle gestures, my mother interpreted them as signs of pregnancy-related anxiety rather than cries for help. The church ladies who had once been my friends accepted Robert's explanations about my need for privacy and rest. The few who asked to visit were told that I was having a difficult pregnancy and needed to avoid any excitement. Gradually, they stopped asking, and I disappeared from their lives as completely as if I had died. The worst part was that I could feel this pregnancy was different from the first. Instead of the robust health and energy I had enjoyed while carrying James Patrick, I was constantly exhausted, frequently nauseous, and struggling with complications that Dr. Morrison attributed to stress and poor nutrition. My body was failing under the constant assault of Robert's violence and the psychological torture of living in permanent fear. By my 7th month, I was spotting regularly and experiencing cramping that Dr. Morrison said was concerning, but not necessarily dangerous. Robert's response to these warning signs was to become even more controlling, even more convinced that my inadequacies as a mother were threatening our child's life. "You're doing it again," he accused when I mentioned the spotting to him. "You're failing just like before, but this time I'm not going to let you get away with it." The beating that followed was the worst yet, a systematic assault that left me barely conscious on our bedroom floor. As I lay there, tasting blood and struggling to breathe through what I suspected were newly broken ribs, I felt something warm and wet spreading between my legs. Even through the haze of pain and shock, I knew what it meant. This pregnancy, like the first, was ending in tragedy. But this time I understood with perfect clarity that Robert's violence had been the cause, not some random medical accident or act of God. And as I felt my second child's life slipping away from me, I realized that if I didn't find a way to escape this hell, the next thing Robert killed would be me. The bleeding started as a trickle, but quickly became a hemorrhage that soaked through my nightgown and into the mattress beneath me. I lay on our bedroom floor where Robert had left me, unable to move without sending waves of agony through my broken ribs, watching my life and my baby's life drain away onto the hardwood planks that Robert had so carefully polished when we first moved into this house. The cramping was unlike anything I had experienced during my first miscarriage. This pain was sharp and relentless, as if my body was violently rejecting what it could no longer protect. I knew I was dying, could feel my strength ebbing with each pulse of blood that left my body. But all I could think about was my unborn daughter. Yes, somehow I knew this baby was a girl, the daughter I would never hold, never name, never watch grow into the strong woman I had once dreamed of becoming myself. "Robert," I whispered, though speaking sent fire through my chest where he had kicked me. "Something's wrong. The baby?" He was sitting on the edge of our bed, his head in his hands, and for a moment I thought he hadn't heard me. When he finally looked up, his eyes were empty of everything: anger, grief, even recognition. It was as if he was looking at a stranger, some broken thing that had wandered into his bedroom and was now bleeding on his floor. "Call Dr. Morrison," I pleaded, each word a struggle. "Please, Robert, I need help." He stared at me for what felt like an eternity before slowly shaking his head. "You did this," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "You killed another one. Why should I help you now?" The coldness in his voice was more terrifying than any of his rages had been. This wasn't the uncontrolled fury that had characterized his recent attacks. This was calculated indifference, as if he had made a conscious decision to let me die, rather than face the shame of another dead baby and the questions that might arise about how it had happened. I tried to crawl toward the telephone on the nightstand, but the movement sent such searing pain through my body that I collapsed again, vomiting blood onto the floor. The metallic taste filled my mouth, and I realized that the internal injuries from his beating were worse than I had initially understood. "You're pathetic," Robert said, watching my struggle with what might have been mild curiosity. "Look at you. What kind of woman can't even keep a baby alive? What kind of wife puts her husband through this twice?" As consciousness faded in and out, I found myself thinking about my mother's words from years ago, when she had explained to me what marriage meant. "A woman's highest calling is to be a helpmeet to her husband," she had said, teaching me to iron his shirts and cook his favorite meals. "Your job is to make his life better, to give him children, to be the kind of wife that brings out the best in a man." I had failed at everything. I hadn't been able to keep Robert from becoming violent. I hadn't been able to carry his children to term. I hadn't even been able to be the kind of wife who inspired love instead of hatred. As I lay bleeding on our bedroom floor, I felt the weight of that failure crushing me more completely than any physical injury ever could. But somewhere in the depths of my fading consciousness, a different voice began to speak. It was quiet at first, barely audible over the roar of pain and despair, but it grew stronger as the minutes passed. This voice didn't sound like my mother or my Sunday school teachers or any of the women who had taught me what I was supposed to be. This voice sounded like me. The real me. The girl who had once dreamed of becoming a teacher, who had loved literature and history, who had believed she deserved happiness. "This isn't your fault," the voice whispered. "You didn't fail. He did this to you. He killed your babies. He's killing you right now, and if you don't fight, he's going to succeed." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't dying because I was weak or flawed or inadequate as a woman. I was dying because my husband was a monster who had systematically destroyed everything good in our life together, including the children we had created. The guilt and shame I had carried for so long weren't mine to bear. They belonged to him. With this understanding came something I hadn't felt in over 2 years. Rage. Not the helpless fury of a victim, but the righteous anger of someone who finally understood the true nature of the injustice being done to her. Robert didn't deserve my submission, my forgiveness, or my life. He certainly didn't deserve to get away with murdering our children through his violence. Somehow, from reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed, I managed to drag myself across the floor to where Robert sat. He was staring out the window now, apparently lost in his own thoughts, and didn't notice my approach until I grabbed his ankle with my blood-slicked hand. "You did this," I gasped, looking up at him with all the hatred I had been too broken to feel before. "You killed them both. You're a murderer." His reaction was immediate and vicious. He yanked his leg away and kicked me in the stomach with such force that I felt something tear inside me. But even as fresh waves of pain crashed over me, I held onto the clarity that rage had brought. I wasn't going to die apologizing for his sins. "Shut up," he snarled, standing over me with his fists clenched. "Shut up before I finish what I started." "Go ahead," I whispered, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in months. "Kill me. But everyone will know what you are. They'll see what you did to me, and they'll know you murdered your own children." The truth of my words seemed to penetrate his fury, and I saw something shift in his expression. Fear. For the first time since our marriage began, Robert looked afraid. Not of me, but of the consequences of his actions. He had been so careful for so long to hide his violence, to present himself as the devoted husband and father, that the possibility of exposure clearly terrified him. He knelt beside me, and for a moment, I thought he might finally show some concern for my condition. Instead, he grabbed my chin and forced me to look at him, his fingers digging into my jawbone hard enough to leave new bruises. "No one will believe you," he said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "You're hysterical, unstable. I'll tell them you did this to yourself, that losing the first baby made you crazy. Who's going to believe a woman who can't even take care of herself?" But even as he spoke, I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how to explain the extent of my injuries if I somehow survived to tell my story. The bleeding was too severe, too obviously the result of trauma, for him to claim it was a natural miscarriage. And the bruises covering my body would be impossible to explain away as accidents or self-harm. "You have to help me," I said. And the desperation in my voice was real, even though it was no longer desperation born of love or hope for our marriage. "If I die like this, there will be questions. People will investigate. Your father, the shop, your reputation, everything will be ruined." I saw the exact moment when self-preservation overcame his desire to let me die. Robert's eyes widened, slightly as he realized that my death would bring exactly the kind of scrutiny he had spent years avoiding. Dr. Morrison would want to know how a healthy pregnant woman had sustained such massive internal injuries. My parents would demand answers. The entire town would be watching and whispering. Without another word, he scooped me up in his arms and carried me to his car. The movement sent fresh agony shooting through my body, but I bit my tongue to keep from crying out. I needed him to get me to the hospital, needed to survive long enough to ensure that this time, someone would see what he had done to me. The drive to Cedar Falls felt endless. I drifted in and out of consciousness, dimly aware of Robert's increasingly frantic appeals for me to stay awake, to hold on, to not give up. His voice carried a convincing note of husbandly concern that would fool anyone who overheard him, but I could see the cold calculation in his eyes when he glanced at me in the passenger seat. He was already crafting his story, I realized. Already planning how to explain my condition in a way that would generate sympathy for himself rather than suspicion. By the time we reached the hospital, he would have convinced himself that he was the tragic victim of circumstances, the devoted husband whose wife kept suffering mysterious accidents and pregnancy complications, despite his best efforts to protect. Her Dr. Morrison met us at the emergency entrance, took one look at my condition, and immediately called for a stretcher and surgical team. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, I heard him questioning Robert about what had happened, how I had gotten injured, whether there had been any signs of complications earlier in the pregnancy. Robert's answers were smooth and consistent with the pattern he had established over the years. I had been having problems all day, he explained. Cramping and spotting that had gotten progressively worse. He had found me collapsed in our bedroom and rushed me to the hospital immediately. He was devastated, of course. Losing 2 babies in such a short time was more than any man should have to bear. As the anesthesia took hold and darkness closed around me, I heard one of the nurses commenting quietly to Dr. Morrison about the extent of my bruising, the pattern of injuries that seemed inconsistent with a simple miscarriage, but their voices faded before I could hear his response, and I slipped into unconsciousness with the terrible certainty that when I woke up, if I woke up, Robert would have successfully convinced everyone that I was simply an unlucky woman, whose body betrayed her repeatedly rather than the victim of deliberate systematic violence. But this time would be different, I promised myself as the world disappeared. This time, I would survive. And when I did, I would find a way to make sure that Robert Whitfield never hurt anyone again. My babies deserved justice, even if I was the only one left to fight for it. The last thing I remember before the darkness claimed me completely was the sound of Robert's voice in the hallway, thick with perfectly performed grief, telling Dr. Morrison how much he loved me, how desperately he wanted to save our marriage and start a family together. To anyone listening, he sounded like the perfect husband facing an unimaginable tragedy. Only I knew that he was actually a murderer whose only concern was covering up his crimes. But soon, very soon, I was going to make sure the whole world knew the truth about Robert James Whitfield. My survival would be my revenge, and his destruction would be my children's memorial. If I lived through the night, everything was going to change. I would make certain of that, even if it was the last thing I ever did. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and dying flowers. The first thing I saw was Robert sitting in a chair beside my bed, his face a mask of carefully practiced concern. He had dark circles under his eyes and stubble on his chin, the perfect picture of a devoted husband who had maintained a constant vigil while his wife fought for her life. "Thank God you're awake," he said, reaching for my hand. His touch made my skin crawl, but I was too weak to pull away. I was so scared I was going to lose you too. The performance was flawless, but I could see through it now. Every word, every gesture, every expression on his face was calculated to reinforce the image he had created for the hospital staff. He was the tragic victim of circumstance, the man whose wife kept suffering inexplicable medical emergencies despite his loving care. "The baby?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. Robert's face crumpled with what appeared to be genuine grief. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. Dr. Morrison did everything he could, but—" He let his voice trail off, allowing the implications to settle in the silence between us. Our daughter was dead. Another child lost to Robert's violence, another life destroyed by his inability to control his rage. I closed my eyes and felt tears sliding down my cheeks, but underneath the grief was something new and dangerous, a cold, calculating fury that I had never experienced before. Dr. Morrison entered the room shortly after I woke up, his expression grave as he explained the extent of my injuries. The internal bleeding had been severe, requiring emergency surgery to repair damaged organs. I had lost a dangerous amount of blood and would need weeks to recover fully. Most concerning of all, the trauma to my reproductive system meant that future pregnancies would be extremely high risk, if possible at all. "What caused all this damage?" I asked, watching his face carefully for any sign that he suspected the truth. Dr. Morrison glanced at Robert before answering, and I saw something in that exchange, a moment of hesitation, perhaps even suspicion. "The bleeding was consistent with severe trauma," he said carefully. "Sometimes these things happen without any clear cause, but the pattern of your injuries—" He paused, choosing his words with obvious care. "What Dr. Morrison is trying to say," Robert interrupted smoothly, "is that you fell down our basement stairs. Don't you remember? You were feeling dizzy and missed a step. I found you at the bottom, bleeding and unconscious." This was the first I had heard of this fabricated explanation, but I could see how perfectly it accounted for my injuries. A fall down wooden stairs could explain the broken ribs, the internal bleeding, even the extensive bruising that covered my body. It was a story that would satisfy casual inquiries while protecting Robert from any serious investigation. But Dr. Morrison's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Margaret," he said, speaking directly to me while Robert watched, "is there anything else you remember about what happened? Any details that might help us understand how you sustained these particular injuries?" This was my moment. This was my chance to tell the truth, to expose Robert for what he really was, to ensure that justice was finally served for our murdered children. I opened my mouth to speak, feeling the words of accusation forming on my tongue, ready to destroy the carefully constructed lies that had protected him for so long. But then I saw Robert's hand move to rest on my arm, his fingers pressing just hard enough to remind me of their strength. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw not just warning, but promise, a clear message about what would happen if I chose to speak the truth in this moment. "I don't remember," I heard myself saying, the words feeling like betrayal even as they left my lips. "Everything is foggy. I just remember feeling dizzy, and then waking up here." Dr. Morrison's face showed disappointment, though whether in my answer or his inability to help me, I couldn't tell. He completed his examination in professional silence, leaving us alone with instructions about my recovery and follow-up care. The moment the door closed behind him, Robert's mask slipped completely. "Good girl," he said, his voice cold and satisfied. "I was wondering if you were going to be smart about this, or if I was going to have to remind you what happens to wives who don't know how to keep their mouths shut." But something fundamental had changed during those 3 days I had spent unconscious. The woman who had been terrified of Robert's threats, who had accepted responsibility for his violence, who had believed herself deserving of punishment, that woman had died on our bedroom floor along with our daughter. The person who had awakened in this hospital bed was someone entirely different. I was no longer afraid of him. Oh, I was still aware of what he could do to me physically. My broken body was testimony to his capacity for violence. But the fear that had paralyzed me for years had been replaced by something much more powerful: absolute clarity about who he was and what needed to happen to him. "I understand," I said quietly, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I understand everything now." Robert smiled, mistaking my calmness for submission. He had no idea that I was already planning his destruction, that every word he spoke was being catalogued as evidence, every threat stored away as ammunition for the war I was going to wage against him. The next 2 weeks in the hospital gave me something I hadn't had in years: time away from Robert's constant surveillance to think and plan. He visited daily, playing the role of devoted husband for the nurses and other patients, but he couldn't watch me every moment. During his absences, I began carefully documenting everything I could remember about our marriage, about the pattern of violence, about the circumstances surrounding both miscarriages. I wrote it all down on scraps of paper torn from magazines, hiding my notes inside the binding of a Bible that one of the church ladies had brought me. Every beating, every threat, every moment of terror was recorded in tiny, careful handwriting that I hoped would someday serve as evidence of Robert's crimes. More importantly, I began to observe the hospital staff, learning which nurses seemed most compassionate, which doctors asked the most probing questions, who might be willing to listen if I found the courage to tell them the truth. There was Sarah, a young nurse from Seattle who had moved to Oregon to work in rural healthcare. She had a directness about her that reminded me of the person I used to be, and she seemed genuinely concerned about the inconsistencies in my medical history. "You've been here twice in 8 months with pregnancy-related emergencies," she mentioned one afternoon while helping me walk the hallways as part of my recovery. "That's unusual for someone your age. Have you considered seeing a specialist when you're released?" "My husband thinks it's best if I just rest at home," I replied carefully. "He says too many doctors might just confuse things." Sarah's expression suggested she found this reasoning as suspect as I did, but she simply nodded and made a note in my chart. I wondered what she was writing, whether my answers were raising red flags for someone trained to recognize the signs of domestic violence. Dr. Morrison's visits became more frequent as my release date approached, and his questions more pointed. He seemed particularly interested in the basement stairs story, asking detailed questions about our house layout, about my history of dizziness, about whether I had experienced any other accidents since our marriage began. "Margaret," he said during one of these conversations, "I want you to know that anything you tell me is confidential. If there's something about your home situation that you're concerned about, something that might be contributing to these medical emergencies, I can help you address it." The offer hung in the air between us, and I could see that he genuinely wanted to help. But I also knew that in 1967, even well-meaning doctors had limited options for women in my situation. If I told him the truth about Robert's violence, what could he actually do? Call the police, who would likely dismiss my claims as hysteria? Contact my parents, who would probably side with my husband? Recommend counseling that Robert would never allow me to attend? More dangerously, if I accused Robert and somehow failed to prove it, I would be completely at his mercy with no one left who might notice if something happened to me. Better to wait, to plan more carefully, to find a way to expose him that didn't leave me vulnerable to his revenge. "I appreciate your concern, Dr. Morrison," I said finally, "but I think I just need to be more careful around the house. Maybe install better lighting on those stairs." He studied my face for a long moment, and I could see that he didn't believe my explanation any more than I did. But without my cooperation, there was nothing he could do except document his suspicions in my medical records and hope that someday they might be useful to someone else trying to help me. When Robert arrived to take me home, he was all solicitous. Attention, helping me into the car with gentle hands and asking repeatedly if I was comfortable. The nurses who saw him off commented on what a wonderful husband I had, how lucky I was to have someone so devoted to my care. If only they knew, I thought as we drove away from the hospital, that they were sending me home with my would-be murderer. The ride back to our house was silent except for Robert's occasional questions about my comfort. But I could feel his satisfaction radiating from him like heat. He believed he had won completely, that he had successfully covered up another act of violence, that I was more broken and compliant than ever, that he could continue his abuse without fear of exposure or consequences. He had no idea that the woman sitting beside him in the passenger seat was no longer his victim. She was his enemy, and she was planning his downfall with the same methodical patience he had once used to isolate and destroy her. When we pulled into our driveway, I saw our house with new eyes, not as the prison it had become, but as a crime scene that contained evidence of Robert's true nature. Every room held memories of violence. Every surface had been witness to his cruelty. But now, instead of triggers for fear, these things represented potential proof of his guilt. "Welcome home, sweetheart," Robert said, helping me out of the car with exaggerated care. "I've missed having you here." "I've missed being here too," I lied, smiling at him with what I hoped looked like gratitude. "It's good to be back where I belong." But as I spoke those words, I made myself a promise that Robert would never hear. This house might be where my nightmare had unfolded, but it would also be where his reckoning began. I was going to destroy him so completely that he would never be able to hurt another woman the way he had hurt me. My babies deserved justice, and I was going to make sure they got it, no matter what it cost me. The war between Robert and me was just beginning, and this time, I intended to win. The months following my return home from the hospital were the most dangerous of my entire marriage, though Robert never realized it. On the surface, I appeared to be exactly what he wanted, a completely broken woman who had finally learned her place. I spoke only when spoken to, moved through our house like a ghost, and seemed to have accepted that my role was to exist solely for his convenience and comfort. But beneath this carefully maintained facade, I was building a case against him with the methodical precision of a prosecutor preparing for the most important trial of her career. Every threat he made was memorized and later written down in my secret journal. Every act of violence was documented with dates, times, and detailed descriptions of the injuries he inflicted. Every lie he told to cover up his abuse was recorded, as evidence of his conscious guilt. The challenge was finding places to hide this growing collection of evidence where Robert would never think to look. He had become increasingly paranoid since my hospital stay, suspicious of any change in my behavior or routine. He searched through my belongings regularly, read any mail that arrived before I could see it, and monitored my activities with the obsessive attention of a prison warden. But Robert's arrogance worked in my favor. He was so convinced of his own intelligence and my complete submission that he never imagined I might be capable of sustained deception. When I spent extra time in the kitchen, he assumed I was simply being more thorough with my cleaning. When I took longer in the bathroom, he attributed it to ongoing health problems from my miscarriage. He never suspected that I was using these moments to write furiously in my hidden journal, or to carefully photograph my injuries with an old camera I had found in our basement. The camera had belonged to Robert's father, abandoned in a box of old tools and forgotten completely. It was an ancient thing that used film I had to special order from a photography shop in Portland, claiming I wanted to take up nature photography as a hobby to help with my recovery. Robert approved of this explanation, seeing it as evidence that I was trying to find harmless ways to occupy my time without bothering him. What he didn't know was that I was creating a visual record of his abuse that would be impossible to explain, away, or dismiss. Every bruise, every cut, every mark his hands left on my body was carefully documented from multiple angles. I learned to work quickly and quietly, developing the film in our basement darkroom late at night, when Robert was deep in the alcohol-induced sleep that had become his nightly routine. The photographs were horrifying to look at, but they were also proof. Here was evidence that no amount of smooth talking could explain away, documentation that would force people to confront the reality of what Robert Whitfield was doing to his wife behind closed doors. But I needed more than just evidence of physical abuse. I needed to establish a pattern that would convince authorities, and more importantly, a jury, that Robert was not just a man with anger management problems, but a calculating predator who had systematically destroyed his wife's life and murdered his own children through deliberate violence. This meant I had to provoke him carefully, to create situations where his true nature would be revealed in ways that I could document. It was a terrifyingly dangerous game, because one miscalculation could result in injuries so severe that I might not survive to use the evidence I was gathering. The first test came in March 1967, about 6 weeks after my return from the hospital. Robert had been in an unusually good mood for several days, whistling while he worked on his car and actually helping with dinner preparation without being asked. I knew from experience that these periods of relative calm were often followed by explosive violence, as if Robert's suppressed rage built up pressure until it had to find release. I decided to accelerate the process by making a small but deliberate mistake that I knew would trigger his anger. While preparing his favorite dinner, pot roast with potatoes and carrots, I deliberately overcooked the meat until it was tough and dry. Not dramatically so, just enough that it would be noticeably imperfect to someone as controlling and critical as Robert. When he took his first bite that evening, I watched his face carefully, seeing the exact moment when he realized the meal wasn't up to his standards. His jaw tightened, and his eyes took on that flat, dangerous look I had learned to fear during our early marriage. "This meat is ruined," he said quietly, setting down his fork with deliberate precision. "How long have you been cooking, Margaret? 3 years? And you still can't manage something as simple as a pot roast?" "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice appropriately meek while my heart raced with anticipation. "I must have left it in the oven too long. I was feeling tired and lost track of time." Robert's expression darkened further. "Tired? You've been home for 6 weeks doing nothing but resting. What could you possibly be tired from?" Here was the moment I had been waiting for. The point where his anger would override his caution, where the mask of reasonable concern would slip to reveal the monster underneath. I had positioned myself carefully so that when he inevitably lashed out, I would be near the window where the evening light would provide perfect illumination for the photographs I planned to take later. "I don't know," I replied, allowing a slight note of defiance to creep into my voice. "Maybe I'm just not feeling like myself yet." The reaction was immediate and violent. Robert stood up so quickly that his chair fell backward, and in 2 steps, he was beside me, his hand tangled in my hair as he yanked my head back at a painful angle. "Not feeling like yourself?" he snarled, his face inches from mine. "Who exactly do you think you are, Margaret? You're my wife. Your job is to take care of me, to make my life easier, not to serve me garbage and make excuses about being tired." He punctuated his words by slamming my face down toward the plate of overcooked meat, stopping just short of actual contact but making his point clear. Then he released my hair so suddenly that I fell forward, catching myself on the table with both hands. "Clean this up," he ordered, gesturing at the dinner that was now scattered across the tablecloth. "And fix me something edible. Maybe if you put some actual effort into your job as a wife, you wouldn't feel so tired all the time." As soon as he left the kitchen, I carefully photographed the scene. The overturned chair, the scattered food, the tablecloth twisted from where I had grabbed it to keep from falling. Then I went to the bathroom and documented the angry red marks his fingers had left in my scalp, the strain in my neck muscles from the violent way he had yanked my head backward, But most importantly, I wrote down everything he had said, word for word, in my hidden journal. Here was clear evidence of his philosophy about marriage, his belief that I existed solely to serve him, his casual willingness to use violence to enforce his control. Any judge or jury who read these accounts would understand that this wasn't a man who occasionally lost his temper. This was someone who used systematic intimidation and abuse to maintain power over his wife. Over the following months, I created dozens of similar incidents, each one carefully designed to reveal different aspects of Robert's abusive nature. I documented his financial control by asking innocent questions about our bank account that sent him into rages about wives who didn't understand their place. I exposed his isolation tactics by mentioning conversations with neighbors, triggering lectures about how I talked too much to people who were none of my business. Most dangerously, I began to push back slightly against his restrictions, testing the boundaries of his control in ways that would provoke increasingly violent responses. When he told me I couldn't attend a church social because wives should focus on their homes rather than gossiping with other women, I suggested that spending time with other church members might help me be a better Christian wife. The beating that followed was savage, but it was also perfectly documented. I had hidden the camera where I could access it quickly after he finished with me, and the photographs I took showed not just the physical damage he had inflicted, but also the methodical nature of his violence. These weren't the random injuries of a man who had lost control. They were the precise markings of someone who knew exactly how to hurt another person without causing obvious external damage. But Robert's violence was escalating in ways that went beyond what I had expected. The controlled brutality of our early marriage was giving way to something more primal and dangerous. I began to suspect that the deaths of our children had damaged something fundamental in his psyche, removing the last restraints on his capacity for cruelty. The most terrifying incident occurred in July 1967, almost exactly a year after we had lost our first son. Robert had been drinking more heavily than usual, and I could see in his eyes the same hollow emptiness that had appeared after our daughter's death. When I served him dinner that evening, a meal I had prepared perfectly, without any deliberate mistakes, he stared at it for a long moment, before sweeping the entire table setting onto the floor. "Do you know what today is?" he asked, his voice unnaturally calm. I did know, of course. July 28th had been our son's due date, the day we should have been celebrating James Patrick's first birthday instead of mourning his death. But admitting that I remembered seemed dangerous, as if acknowledging the anniversary might trigger something worse than his usual violence. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said carefully. Robert's smile was the most frightening thing I had ever seen. "Our son would have been 1 year old today," he said, still in that eerily calm voice. "If you hadn't killed him, if you had been the kind of mother who could keep a baby safe." Without warning, he grabbed a carving knife from the scattered silverware on the floor and held it to my throat, pressing the blade just hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "Maybe I should finish what I started," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "Maybe it's time to stop pretending that you deserve to live when our children don't." For a moment, I thought he actually might kill me. The knife was sharp, and I could feel it trembling slightly in his hand as if he was struggling with the decision. But then something shifted in his expression, and he stepped back, lowering the weapon with a disgusted shake of his head. "You're not even worth it," he said, tossing the knife aside. "You're nothing. Less than nothing. Our babies were worth 100 of you." As he stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me bleeding and surrounded by broken dishes, I realized that I was running out of time. Robert's violence was becoming less controlled, more potentially lethal. If I didn't act soon to expose him and escape, one of these documented incidents would be my last. But I also realized that I finally had everything I needed to destroy him completely. The evidence I had gathered over the past months painted a picture so damning that no jury in the world would fail to convict him. The question now was how to get that evidence to people who could use it, while ensuring that Robert couldn't silence me before justice was served. The end game of our marriage was approaching, and I was determined that when it came, I would be the one left standing. Robert had murdered our children and nearly killed me, but he was about to learn that he had failed to destroy the most dangerous thing of all, a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The opportunity I had been waiting for came in September 1967, when Robert's father suffered a heart attack and was hospitalized in Portland. Robert would need to stay there for at least a week to handle the business and his father's medical care, giving me the first extended period of freedom I had experienced since our marriage began. "I don't trust you alone for that long," Robert said the night before his departure, his eyes narrow with suspicion. "You'll probably do something stupid while I'm gone." "Where would I go?" I asked, letting exhaustion color my voice. "I barely have the energy to keep house. You don't need to worry about me." He seemed satisfied with this response, but I could see him calculating, trying to determine if there was any way I might use his absence to betray him. Finally, he made arrangements with Mrs. Patterson from church to check on me daily, ostensibly out of concern for my health, but actually to ensure I didn't leave the house or contact anyone who might help me. What Robert didn't know was that I had been slowly building a relationship with Mrs. Patterson during his brief absences for work, carefully revealing small pieces of my situation without directly accusing him of abuse. She had begun to suspect that something was wrong in our marriage, commenting on my weight loss and withdrawn behavior with increasing concern. The morning Robert left for Portland, I waited exactly 30 minutes after his car disappeared from view before beginning the most important work of my life. I had planned every detail of the next 7 days with military precision, knowing that this might be my only chance to escape and ensure that Robert faced consequences for his crimes. First, I retrieved all my hidden evidence from its various hiding places throughout the house. The photographs, the detailed journal entries, the medical records I had secretly copied, everything that documented the systematic abuse and the deaths of our children. I organized it all chronologically, creating a timeline that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Next, I called Dr. Morrison's office and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon, claiming I was having complications from my previous hospitalization. When I arrived, I brought copies of my documentation and sat across from him in his office, finally ready to tell the complete truth. "Dr. Morrison," I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal, "I need to tell you what really happened to me and my babies." His expression shifted immediately from professional concern to intense focus as I began to speak. I showed him the photographs of my injuries, the detailed accounts of Robert's violence, the evidence that both miscarriages had been caused by deliberate abuse rather than medical complications. "Margaret," he said quietly when I finished, "why didn't you tell me this before? I could have helped you." "I was afraid," I admitted, "and I didn't have proof, but I do now." Dr. Morrison examined the evidence with the thoroughness of someone who understood its implications. As a physician, he could see that the pattern of injuries was consistent with repeated domestic violence. As a member of our community, he was horrified to learn that the man everyone considered a devoted husband was actually a murderer. "We need to contact the authorities immediately," he said, reaching for his phone. "This evidence needs to be turned over to the police before your husband returns." But I stopped him with a raised hand. "Not yet. There's something else I need to do first." That evening, I drove to Portland using money I had been secretly saving for over a year. I had never driven such a distance alone, but desperation gave me courage I didn't know I possessed. I found Robert at the hospital where his father was recovering and observed him from a distance, noting which room he was in and what his routine seemed to be. Then I went to the Portland Police Department and requested to speak with a detective. Officer Janet Walsh was a rarity in 1967, a female police officer who specialized in crimes against women and children. When I showed her my evidence and told her my story, her reaction was immediate and decisive. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "what you've documented here represents multiple felonies, including 2 counts of manslaughter in the deaths of your children. We're going to arrest your husband tonight." Robert was taken into custody at the hospital, charged with assault, battery, and involuntary manslaughter in the deaths of our babies. The evidence I had gathered was so comprehensive and damning that he couldn't mount any effective defense. The photographs alone made it impossible for him to claim that my injuries were accidental, and the medical records clearly showed that both miscarriages had resulted from severe trauma. The trial, held in the spring of 1968, became a sensation in our small community. For the first time, people were forced to confront the reality that domestic violence existed in their midst, that a man they had admired and trusted was capable of murdering his own children through calculated brutality. Robert's defense attorney tried to portray me as mentally unstable, claiming that I had fabricated the evidence out of grief and hysteria. But the prosecution, led by District Attorney Helen Crawford, another pioneering woman in a male-dominated field, systematically destroyed every one of his arguments. "The defendant wants you to believe that his wife somehow inflicted these injuries on herself," she told the jury during closing arguments, displaying enlarged photographs of my battered body. "That she repeatedly beat herself so severely that she miscarried 2 children, all as part of some elaborate fantasy. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence speaks for itself. Robert Whitfield is not the victim here. He is a cold-blooded killer who murdered his own children and nearly killed his wife." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Robert was sentenced to 25 years in prison, and the judge's words at sentencing have stayed with me for over 5 decades. "Mr. Whitfield," Judge Morrison said, "you have committed crimes that strike at the very heart of human decency. You were entrusted with the care and protection of your wife and children, and instead you became their destroyer. This court can only hope that your imprisonment serves as a warning to other men who might consider similar acts of violence." Robert showed no emotion as he was led away in handcuffs, but I saw him glance at me one final time. There was no remorse in his eyes, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. Even then, even facing decades in prison, he remained convinced that he was the wronged party in our tragic story. After the trial, I left Millfield forever. The notoriety of the case had made it impossible for me to rebuild my life there, and I needed to escape the memories that haunted every familiar place. I moved to Portland, where Officer Walsh helped me find work with a women's advocacy organization that was just beginning to address the problem of domestic violence. My experiences, as horrible as they had been, gave me unique insight into what abused women needed to escape their situations. I helped establish the first domestic violence shelter in Oregon, drawing on my own ordeal to create safe spaces where women could rebuild their lives without fear. In 1970, I met David Chen, a social worker whose own commitment to helping vulnerable people matched my own passion for justice. Our courtship was slow and careful. I needed to learn that not all men were like Robert, that love could exist without violence, that marriage could be a partnership rather than a prison. David and I married in 1972 and eventually had 2 children. Together, Sarah in 1973 and Michael in 1975. Raising them was both joyful and terrifying, as I constantly battled the fear that something might happen to these precious lives I had been given a second chance to protect. But unlike my first marriage, our home was filled with laughter and genuine affection. David never raised his voice in anger, never lifted his hand against me or our children, never tried to control or diminish me. He understood that my strength had been forged in fire, and he celebrated rather than threatened it. I spent the next 4 decades working to help other women escape situations like mine. I testified before Congress about the need for federal domestic violence legislation, helped establish crisis hotlines and legal aid programs, and spoke at countless conferences about the importance of believing women when they report abuse. Robert. died in prison in 1989, 22 years into his sentence. I felt no satisfaction at the news, only a deep sadness for all the lives that had been destroyed by his violence, including his own. Our children, James Patrick and the daughter I never got to name, would have been adults by then, perhaps with children of their own. Now, at 79, I tell this story not for sympathy or attention, but because I know there are women watching who see themselves in my experience. Women who believe they deserve the abuse they receive, who think they have no options, who are convinced that no one will believe them if they speak out. To those women, I want to say this: you are not alone. You are not crazy. You are not responsible for your abuser's actions. And most importantly, you can survive and rebuild your life, no matter how impossible it seems right now. The scars from my first marriage will never completely fade, but they no longer define me. I am a survivor, a fighter, a woman who refused to let evil triumph over good. I am the mother of children who never drew breath, but whose brief existence gave meaning to everything that followed. And I am proof that even in the darkest circumstances, even when all hope seems lost, the human spirit can not only endure but ultimately prevail. Justice may be delayed, but it is never denied to those who have the courage to fight for it. My name is Margaret Eleanor Whitfield Chen, and this is my story of survival, justice, and redemption. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are stronger than you know. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.